Hey out there, welcome back to our Land Bulletin series. I'm Haley Murr. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Development here at Murr Ranch Group. For those of you who are first joining, this is the Land Bulletin series where every other week we discuss the ranch and sporting market, buying and selling advice, the latest best stewardship practices, as well as topics currently impacting landowners. Murr Ranch Group is a full-service ranch real estate brokerage and consulting company focusing on legacy ranches and sporting and conservation properties around the West. Today, we're going to be discussing something that is super important and will continue to be relevant and important to ranchers as the years go on. Today, we're going to be discussing renewable energy and more specifically, what solar and wind energy can do for landowners as an asset strategy. Thank you to everyone who has submitted questions. We'll try to get to them on this broadcast, but if we don't get them today, we'll reach out to you directly. Helping me out today is the team at Clean Energy, Anna Buongiorno and Judd Rogers. Welcome, Anna and Judd.
Thanks, Haley. Good to be here.
Awesome. I'm so happy that you guys are here, and I'm so excited to learn about just kind of how this can be an asset strategy for landowners, because that's just something we don't regularly talk about or know a lot about. So it's good to have some experts in the field. Before we get into it, I'd love to know just kind of your backgrounds and kind of your roles at Scout Energy. So I'll start with you, Judd.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Haley. Judd Rogers. I'm the Senior Director of Development for our new projects team at Scout Clean Energy. And what essentially that means is our team is really responsible for creating this strategic direction of where we want to develop projects across the country, which technologies we want to pursue, the prospecting exercise of looking for sites, as well as boots on the ground, starting to engage with stakeholders, landowners, possibly some of the folks that listen to your podcast.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on board, Judd. And Anna, what do you do over at Scout?
Yeah, so thanks so much for having us. I work with Judd on the new projects team. I'm a senior project manager. And as Judd mentioned, we're really focused on working with landowners and communities in the earliest stages of renewable energy project development. So we're talking to folks, we're talking with counties and trying to figure out where is a good fit for a project and how can we build something that's going to be beneficial for a region.
Awesome. I love to hear it. And I guess, before we go into this whole podcast, we'd love to know more about Scout Energy and, your place in the market space. And then I know, Anna, you were going to go over some terms about, what we're going to be talking about so people don't get lost. But I guess we'll start first with Scout Energy and kind of who you guys are.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll kick that off. And I will use some terms that then Anna will define. We're using some energy jargon. But Scout Clean Energy, a fairly young company. We started in 2016, but we've accomplished a lot in that, up till today. As a company, we develop, build, own, and operate projects across the United States. We started primarily as a wind company, and a lot of the founders of the company came from the wind industry, but we've quickly evolved to be a developer of wind, solar, and now battery storage projects. We currently operate over 1,000 megawatts. Anna will define what a megawatt is, at about 1,200 megawatts of operating wind assets that span coast to coast. We have a project in California. We have a project that we manage out in Pennsylvania. And we also have a very robust development portfolio of projects that we've started to greenfield and that are working their way through the development life cycle. And that comprises about almost 22,000 megawatts of projects. And we're currently active in about 24 states across the country.
Wow, that's huge. And so what is that megawatt? Why is that important?
Yeah, so we get this question all the time, and a megawatt is really just another term used to measure power, and it can be defined in a couple of different ways depending on what your interests are. So oftentimes when we're talking with landowners, we talk about how many acres are needed to produce a megawatt of wind or solar power. Solar, you're using a bit more land. It can be anywhere from 6 to 8 acres to create a megawatt of solar energy. For wind projects, the actual footprint is a lot lower, but because turbines have to be spaced out across a property, you end up using closer to 75 acres a megawatt across an entire project. And then the other way to think about a megawatt is how how that powers homes or businesses across the country. So typically in a place like Colorado, where I know we're all at right now, a megawatt of renewable energy power can produce enough power for anywhere from 200 to 300 homes over a year. A couple other terms that I'd love to define that I think are really beneficial is what type of development does Scout work in? So we work in an industry that's called utility scale power. This is a little bit different than residential or commercial solar or even community solar. And so a question we get asked all the time from folks is, can you put solar on my house? That's not necessarily what we're doing. A lot of the work that we do is more looking at the large projects that you see out in fields as you're driving across major interstates, anywhere from 1,000 acres for a solar project to 10,000 acres for a wind project. So it's really the large scale stuff.
Okay.
A couple other things I'd love to define. One is the transmission lines and capacity. So we'll talk about that a little bit during the show today. Projects that we work on connect to these transmission lines. It's a little bit different than a distribution line. So a transmission line is a higher voltage, and it's really intended to move power across large distances. So this would be like a lattice structure out in the field versus a distribution line, which is what you're going to see in urban areas or maybe going to a house, and that's usually a lower voltage line. So we're really focused on those transmission lines for our projects.
Okay. Awesome. Well, that does clear things up. And I was talking to you guys earlier. I think this would have been super helpful with other live streams if we had kind of gone through the specifics and the terminology that we're going to use. So thank you for kind of getting us up to speed on what we're going to be listening to. But I guess we'll go right into just kind of what we are focusing on today was how can renewable energy serve as a value add for landowners? I think there's a lot of misinterpretations, miscommunications. People just don't really know as a landowner, what can renewable energies do for me? And, I think to your guys' point, there is a huge value add for landowners. So I just love to kind of go through that. And Anna, if you want to walk through that with us first, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the biggest benefit that landowners can realize from wind and solar projects is income. The agreements that we're reaching are typically lease agreements, sometimes purchase agreements, and we could talk about that a little bit. But these are long-term arrangements for reliable income for anywhere from 30 to, some of these agreements now are 50 plus years. So this is a way for landowners to either replace their income from farming or ranching practices or to supplement their income. Things like wind can be a bit more complementary. We all know that farming and ranching aren't really for the faint of heart, and that there's a lot of challenges associated with that. They kind of grow all of the time. So this is another opportunity for folks to monetize the assets that they have, the land that they've been stewards of for a long time. And then, beyond them just receiving that revenue, there's opportunities when it comes time to sell property or if they're looking to buy property. So the leases that we put in place for wind or solar projects, those will run with the land during a sale, and those can add increased value. I was actually at a brokerage meeting for some folks in Colorado a couple of weeks ago, and they were marketing opportunities for ranches for sale. And a couple of them had wind and solar leases on them. And it was really interesting to see how that could impact the value and the opportunities that potential investors could see on that property. And I think, over the next couple of years, we're going to see a lot of changes as it relates to property law as well, and kind of how we attribute value to different wind and solar rights on properties. So I think there's a lot of opportunities here for landowners to realize some value from these types of projects.
Okay. And in your opinion, and don't have to go into specifics, but you were saying kind of what wind and solar can do for a valuation of a property.
Mm-hmm.
Does it improve it to, a certain percentage? Is it, across the board? Is it kind of different from project to project? What have you seen just in terms of value of land?
Yeah, that's tough. I don't have a specific percentage that I could share, but I think you could relate it to any other land purchase where a new owner is looking for the revenue streams on the property. Are you ranching? Are you farming? What has that yield looked like over previous years? And so this is providing that guaranteed income. So there's going to be a definite value add from that perspective, because they know once I take ownership of this property, especially if it has an operational project on it, there's guaranteed income from that. If not, it is a bit more not speculative, but there is, risk involved there. If you maybe have a lease in place, but a project isn't operational, there is a certain likelihood that the project is going to move forward or not. But I think even just having that option and that potential upside could impact land valuation.
Awesome. No, I love that. And I think it would be really neat to do some type of study, maybe in-house or working with you guys to kind of see what those leases do for landowners. Because as a seller, that's a huge benefit to, any way you can increase the value of your land or show that you have these other forms of income already going is a big attribute.
Definitely.
And from a scale perspective, I know you guys typically work on larger scale projects. What does that mean for, if I'm a smaller landowner and I have like 100 acres, it's not a big operation, but I kind of want to get involved or I want to see the income potential that is there. Are there things that those landowners can also participate in?
Definitely. So, as great as it would be for each project to just be a single landowner, there's one person you're having to deal with to get everything done on a project. That's not the case in most areas that we work in. Oftentimes our projects can be a group of anywhere from 5 to, there are projects that we've worked on in the Midwest that have over 100 different landowners on them.
Got it.
So you have folks from all different size acreages that are getting involved, whether it's, as you mentioned, 40 to 100 acres, or folks that maybe have a couple thousand acres. And so we work with people at all different levels, and there's opportunities for them to be involved in the project, to realize some of that income, and then to realize some of the other benefits that I know we'll talk about a little bit later.
Awesome. And so I know we looked at the value add from like an income, the leasing, those types of strategies. Judd, what are some other ways landowners can benefit from renewable energy projects like this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think wind and solar and ultimately battery storage can be beneficial complements to a rural community, whether it's farming or ranching. Farmers often use the term yields when they talk about their crops. And sometimes I like to say, well, there's yield above your fields. And that's in the form of wind or solar. And I think the benefits that come to communities by growing corn or soy or ranching can also come through harvesting the wind or solar resources in that community. Anna talked a little bit about one, just the kind of the revenue that can come to the landowner through typically a lease, and the fact that it's a very reliable revenue stream. It's a guaranteed payment for a long period of time, so essentially it's annuity that a landowner can rely on over the long period of time, whether they're planning on making capital investments to their property, they want to buy some new equipment to operate their ranch or their farm. And then also the complementary aspect of renewable energy. Certainly there's nuances between wind and solar. As Anna talked about, the footprint of a wind project that you're actually taking out of production or disrupting is an acre or less, if you factor in the tower location and the access roads. So it's very minimal footprint, but it covers a large area. So it's very complementary with continuing ranching or farming or even hunting for that matter on your property, where solar is a more, it's a development or a project that it really takes up a larger piece of land and takes that area out of production. But at the end of the day, I think there's also a value add to the community at large. Certainly, these projects bring a lot of tax revenue through sales tax or ultimately property taxes, and that trickles into the community and benefits the schools and the ability to work on the roads in the community or other infrastructure is oftentimes greatly needed in those communities.
And I do love, because rural communities are always thinking about how they can work together, because private land it's all connected, from the water to the animals that kind of navigate those different corridors. But like solar and wind is the same thing, and energy, to be able to work together to kind of bring that to the larger community at scale is pretty awesome. And I think a lot of ranchers are looking to do something like that. So I love that kind of component, the value add. And do you have any examples of, supplementary income from renewables, maintaining like the legacy of a ranch, um, regardless of maybe future water or weather conditions, something that you guys have maybe seen in your line of work?
Yeah, we've got a couple examples. Anna, do you want me to touch on those?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so a project we developed in Iowa. There was a family that it's a legacy farm that had been in the family for over 100 years, and by having a wind project on their land, they were really able to continue farming. And that supplemental income basically kind of was a make or break situation for them, and it really allowed them to continue what they've been doing for generations. And then at one of our operating wind projects, Ranchero Wind Farm down in Texas, in Crockett County, Texas, the 300 megawatt project, we worked with a couple different ranches. I think total it's about 5 different ranches that basically comprise the entire footprint of the project. And so, as Anna mentioned, sometimes we're dealing with hundreds of landowners for a project, and other times we're working with just a couple ranchers. But those ranches down in Texas also have been able to kind of maintain the ranching operations while having this wind farm on their property as well.
That's great, because I do think there's kind of this idea out there, if you do this or this, it really disrupts everything else that you've been managing on your land. And that's kind of where we get some pushback. So it's really good to know, these are just these supplemental things that you can add to your overall management plan of your property, but also get another stream of income. And that kind of brings up another question. You talked about a ranch in Iowa, you talked about a ranch in Texas, but like some of our conservation kind of properties that we've talked about in the past on other live streams, some properties aren't really built for one type of energy versus the other. So in your guys' opinion, and I know this is not like a cookie cutter, there's a lot of variables in there. What kind of property is a good candidate for renewable energy projects? And like what goes into that when you guys are looking at assessing a property?
Yeah, happy to chat about that. And I'll start kind of high level with some of the big, most important ones but also talk a little bit how there's a lot of nuance and additional constraints that we evaluate as we dig into a project. But the main ones, and that have been this way forever, is the resource. So, we're always looking for ideal conditions for a wind resource or a solar resource. Wind is much more nuanced over, let's say, 100 square miles, where solar is much more homogeneous. And so with wind, you're really looking for where those kind of optimal wind speeds are. And sometimes those are driven by topography or other meteorological nuances that really bring the wind resource up in certain areas. And so we're doing a lot of meteorological work and studies on where that wind resource is. And we really need a strong wind resource for a project. That being said, the technology over the last decade has evolved where the turbines are able to capture more wind or lower wind speeds. So the rotor diameter of the blades are getting longer. So essentially, it's a bigger net that's catching more wind, and you can do that with lower wind speeds. So what we're starting to see is areas that maybe a decade ago were not considered viable from a wind project perspective are now viable because the technology's evolved to be able to capture lower wind speeds. Another really important one is transmission lines. As Anna mentioned, it's really important to us that we can get the power onto the transmission system. And so oftentimes, especially in rural areas, you might be quite a ways from a transmission line. And so it's important for us to try to site a project that's as close to a transmission line as possible, because however many additional miles we need to build to get to the transmission line just adds additional cost. And so usually we're trying to find projects that are within 15 or 20 miles of an existing transmission line. But there's certainly cases here in Colorado of projects that have built a 100-mile, what we call a gen-tie line, which connects you into the transmission network. So depending on the scale of the project, you might be able to go quite a distance with your transmission lines. We're also looking for an area that the permitting is open to development, whether that's through county ordinances or state regulations that allow for wind and solar to be developed in certain communities or certain parts of the state or in the county. So we really have to make sure that those regulations or ordinances are compatible with the work that we're doing. So we look at those very closely. And I think some of the other there's probably 25 other constraints that we look at, and I think it's always interesting when I talk with a landowner that they often think that we can put a turbine or a solar project anywhere we want, but there's so many things that determine where we can ultimately put a turbine or a solar panel. Those are things from airspace constraints as it relates to wind projects, environmental constraints, setbacks from homes, setbacks from roads, setbacks from other infrastructure that we have to be aware of. So at the end of the day, oftentimes where we put things are really dictated by those setbacks, not necessarily by where we ideally want to put something.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that kind of brings up another, do public lands, and this is just a personal question of mine, like if you're really close to a national forest or BLM land or state or something like that, are there constraints there too when trying to figure out if you should put a project in?
There can be, and certainly there's examples of projects that have been built on federal land. The BLM in particular, if you were to kind of compare BLM or national forest, the BLM has a path to put a project on BLM land that's a little bit more frameworked at this point. But there's certainly additional considerations that have to be taken into account if you're looking at either having direct impact on federal lands or state lands or tribal lands. And, some of those could be viewshed, or some of those can be actual physical impacts. If maybe you need an access road that goes through federal lands, maybe your transmission line or gen tie that I just mentioned needs to go through federal lands. That all needs to be factored in because there's a whole different permitting regime that would be required if you're going to impact federal lands. It's called federal nexus, where you have to go through a different permitting process.
Okay. And with that, I mean, so there's all these different kind of reasons why a piece of land might be better suited than another. Is there anything a landowner can do before kind of reaching out to even you guys? Like what can they collect? What are the different things, permitting, all of that they should bring to you guys before even kind of getting their property assessed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things that can trip things up out of the gates is title.
Okay.
And so oftentimes we'll engage with the landowner. One of the first things that we do is sign a lease, and having clean title, being able to demonstrate chain of ownership, if whether the mineral rights have been severed or whether they still run with the surface rights, is really important for us to understand. And so if they can get those ducks in a row, it's super helpful for us to move that process along in a more efficient manner.
Okay. I feel like title is always kind of the end all be all for all land-based projects. So
Yeah,
making sure,
absolutely.
and we've talked, not to reiterate, we've always talked about TBD title commitments. So if, you don't have a title commitment or your family's on the ranch forever and you haven't exchanged deeds or done title in a while, reach out to you guys or a title company and get that TBD title so that you can really look into it with, an assessment with you guys. Another thing I just would love to know, I mean, we've talked about kind of the type of things that you should be looking out for when seeing if your property is suitable. Do you guys have an example of kind of a primo ranch, whether that be in Colorado or something like that really fit the mold for either a solar or a wind project that you guys have worked on?
Sure. Yeah. One comes to mind in Colorado, and it's an example where we actually ended up purchasing a ranch. It was in receivership. It was a 5,000 acre ranch. And ultimately we were looking at it just through our prospecting. We were looking at maps, and there was an area that was right next to a brand new substation that had been built. And, I mentioned we want to be close to a transmission line, but the real prize is if you're close to a substation, because that's infrastructure that you don't necessarily have to build if there's one right next to your project. So there's this nice shiny new substation, and we started looking at the land, and we discovered that it was a 5,000 acre ranch that was in receivership. So we worked through the local judge, and actually we're part of a essentially an auction, and we put our best foot forward and ended up buying the ranch. And what we really liked about the ranch is both its proximity to a substation, but also that it was quite flat. For solar, the flatter the better.
Okay.
And then also, after we bought the ranch, we now have leased it back. It's a grazing lease with a local member of the community. So it's really worked out well. It really hasn't changed much locally within the community as we're working to develop that project. And it's just been a great asset that we've added to our portfolio.
Okay. That's awesome. That's good to know. I feel like, we talked about it a little bit yesterday, Judd, when we were talking about okay, I grew up in Nevada and everyone would think that this would be a really good place to have wind, but it's really important to know the specifics of what you should be looking for, because even if it's windy, that doesn't mean it's a good candidate for necessarily turbines or something like that.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. There's just so many different variables that we have to take into consideration. And over time, as a developer 15, 20 years ago, you basically put out your map and you'd overlay it with a wind resource map, and you'd just circle the areas where the wind is and you'd be good to go. But over time, either those projects have been developed, or there's been more nuance that's been added to the development process. So yeah, there's just a lot of things to take into consideration. Keeps us busy.
I mean, I've already learned a ton that I didn't know before, so this is super helpful. So, okay, you go through the stage of figuring out maybe my property is a good candidate. You start maybe collecting some title information, that kind of thing. Then how can landowners identify reliable renewable energy developers to work with? Because I feel like, you do hear of a lot of different companies out there, but to your point, Anna, earlier when you were saying we work on larger scale projects, we work with like landowners. I think people they don't really know where to start. So I'd love some advice for landowners out there.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely one of the biggest challenges that these landowners face when they're trying to do a project on their property, especially, over the last 5-10 years, you've just seen this massive influx of more developers in the space. And so where there maybe used to be 20 companies that you had to compare and make a decision, now there's, probably hundreds out there just in the US alone. And oftentimes when we talk to landowners, we might be the third or fourth, or even sometimes the 15th or 16th person that's called them asking about their property and whether or not they're interested. And I think landowners oftentimes don't really know what metrics are most useful when kind of comparing offers that they're receiving, and how do they make the best decision that is not only going to be the best for them financially, in terms of getting, a good competitive rate that is going to pay them appropriately for the use of their land, but at the same time, who's going to be a good long-term partner for this project? Who's actually going to get this project done right, is not going to cut corners, and is going to be there for kind of them in the community, and not just kind of build this project and then be off to the next one. So I think there's a couple of things that folks can do. One is it's just really basically, doing some research and kind of trying to understand the reputation of different companies within the industry. Most companies now are going to have a website. They're going to have information from landowners that they've worked with on their website. You can typically ask for referrals and talk with other people that have worked with them on projects to understand what their experience was like, the good and the bad. You can see how long companies have been around. As I mentioned, there's probably companies popping up every couple of weeks right now. And so seeing not only how long has that company itself been around, but also the people that are working in that company. Are these folks that have ample experience in the space and are going to be able to use that to develop a project successfully? I think what's also important to consider is the developer that you're trying to work with somebody that has worked in a similar space or with a similar technology? At the very beginning, when we were defining terms, we talked about the difference between utility scale and maybe rooftop solar. Those are two completely different industries. And so somebody that does one doesn't necessarily, or doesn't always have the skills to do the other. And so understanding, is the person you're proposing to work with, have they built large projects? Have they built projects in the West or in the Midwest where you're looking to lease land? Have they built projects on a similar scale, or is this going to be way bigger than anything that they've ever taken on before. I think something that to me is very important, and I think it's going to be important to a lot of your listeners, is also understanding, are these developers good long-term partners for the communities that they're trying to work in? So I mentioned you have a lot of developers that come in and build a project and then might not have kind of a lasting presence. And part of that is because these projects, once they're operational, there's just a minimal amount of work that goes into keeping them up and running. And that's part of the benefit, right? Is that they don't require all of the kind of full-time attention that maybe a traditional energy plant would require. But at the same time, if you don't have people there in the area, you don't always understand, okay, how is this impacting the community? Are there things that we could be changing or improving? So I know that's something that Scout prides themselves on particularly, is that we do a lot of work with communities and trying to get involved in community events and sponsoring different events, or just helping provide information to communities about renewable energy. And then kind of the big one, is making sure that the lease rates that you're being offered, or the purchase price for that matter, is competitive. And we talk about this a lot in the work that Judd and I do, and it's a tricky balance. Our goal is always to kind of, particularly for solar, to beat the rates that somebody would be able to receive from farming or ranching. We want this to be something that is more attractive to them, to help them make that decision. But at the same time, the market that we're in is extremely competitive. Every project is kind of bidding against one another to try to get the lowest energy price. For our benefit as consumers, like, we all want low energy prices, but also it's the projects with the lowest energy price are going to be the ones that get built. So how do we make sure that we're not kind of inflating our costs to a point that's going to make a project uncompetitive and not actually be able to get built, so that the landowner can realize some of that long-term revenue? So it's kind of hard to thread that needle between, what's the best rate that somebody can get without it being overinflated. And a lot of that, again, kind of goes back to finding a responsible and reliable developer to partner with.
Yeah, like we've kind of reiterated throughout this conversation, is just, making sure that this is an attractive supplementary income to ranchers, I think is a huge task, while also being competitive, to your point. And I think, we've learned a ton already. And I know you guys have a lot of materials and educational tools out there. So if those of you who are listening have a lot of different questions, I'm sure you do. These two know a lot, as you can probably tell. So, after this, if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll direct your questions over to Scout. But we really appreciate you guys and what you're doing for rural communities, for ranchers, and then just in terms of, the environment. It's really great to hear companies like you out there. And I'm so happy that the Land Report connected us a couple months ago. But I appreciate you guys, and we look forward to working with you in the future. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you, Haley. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And if you want to learn more about the process of renewable energies and have an assessment of how your property can benefit, check out Scout's website at www.scoutscleanenergy.com, or call Anna directly, 720-741-1051. If you want to learn more about the ranch real estate market or ranch marketing process, please be sure to subscribe to our newsletter on our website at www.merranchgroup.com, or give us a call at 303-623-4545. Thanks so much. See you next time.